Hi, I'm Zibby Owens, and I am the host of this podcast, Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. I am also a newly minted USA Today best-selling author of the novel Blank. I've created a whole community of book lovers around this podcast, a publishing company, reading retreats, a bookstore, and more. Learn more at zibbymedia.com or follow me on social at Zibby Owens or join the community at Zibby Readers. Claire Bidwell Smith is back on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books after, I think, a 4 or 5 year hiatus. She is the author of Conscious Grieving, a Transformative Approach to Healing from Loss. She is a therapist specializing in the grief, which is an understatement because she is like one of the leaders in the grief field. She is the author of The Rules of Inheritance, a memoir, which is really one of my favorite memoirs, a Books for a Better Life Award nominee. She also wrote After This, When Life is Over, Where Do We Go? And Anxiety, the Missing Stage of Grief. An expert in her field, she has spoken on countless news outlets, radio and podcast shows, and consults companies like Twitter, GoodRx, Damani for Grief, and the National Funeral Home Association, and sits on the board of Endwell. Her writing has been featured in many national publications, including the New York Times, The Atlantic, Scientific American, Psychology Today, and Oprah Magazine, and she is hopefully writing a memoir for Zibby Books. Welcome, Claire. Thank you so much for coming on Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books to discuss Conscious Grieving, a Transformative Approach to Healing from Loss.
Thank you, Zibby. It's always good to see you.
So much has happened between us since our last podcast on the show. If listeners want to Google or search our last episode was forever ago, and I had read your book. I was such a massive fan. I could not believe I got to see you in LA and that you were coming to my house, and then you showed up with your baby, we passed between us the whole time, and I was like, oh my gosh, Claire Bidwell Smith is like in my dining room with her baby. This is so cool.
It was one of those mom moments where I suddenly lost childcare, and I was like, well, the podcast is called Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books, so I'm sure she'll be fine if I bring my baby because there's no other choice.
I was totally fine, and oh my gosh, I couldn't believe now he's so big. So how old is he? That'll tell us. He's 5. Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, that tells us how long ago it was. So, oh my goodness. And then you became a Zibby Books author along the way. So eventually you'll write that book. And along the way, Kyle's production company optioned The Rules of Inheritance. So hopefully that will be a show soon, which is really cool.
Yes, I know so much. And you became like a media mogul. And you're just changing the face of publishing day by day. It's amazing. I'm so proud of you. We've both a lot has happened in the last 5 years.
A lot has happened. And you've lived in every place in the entire United States. But anyway. Yes, a lot of personal changes. Anyway, so it's great to have you back. This time we are talking about Conscious Grieving, which is not a memoir like your last book, but much more of not a workbook, but why don't you describe it? What's the word? Boarded piece, like a help.
Self-help.
Self-help. Thank you. Oh my gosh. I don't usually do podcasts this late in the afternoon when my brain shuts off. So anyway, it's my fault. Okay. Talk about your self-help book and your approach and your whole experience as a grief counselor for so long and what you learned and why you wrote the book.
Yeah, this is really my letter to people who are grieving. It's actually written in the second person. I just recorded the audio recently, and it struck me that if you listen to the audio version, it's like I'm just talking directly to you, which is what I wanted the book to feel like. This book's a kind of synthesis of everything I've learned in the past 20 years of being a grieving person and also someone who's been sitting with thousands of people along their journeys of loss. I've been a therapist for 15 years now, and private practice, hospice, retreats, and support groups. And every day I'm sitting with somebody who's going through immense loss. And I went into this work because I lost both of my parents when I was young. And I went into this work thinking I knew a lot about grief, and I only knew my grief. And since then, I have learned so much. I learned something new from every single person I sit with about grief. It's so universal and yet also so deeply individual. Our relationships, the way we lose people, our personalities. And so I tried to really this is the book where I summed up everything I know about grief. And the really big thing I know about it is that we have to lean into it in order to heal. And that when we do lean into it, there's a lot of hope and transformation possible, even in like the deepest anguish and sorrow of some losses. And so that's why it's called conscious grieving. It's just about being intentional. I say in the book, loss is something that happens to us, but how we grieve is up to us.
Mm-hmm.
It's just about really kind of leaning into this process with intention and consciousness.
It doesn't feel like it's up to us.
It doesn't.
It feels like it's taking over your body and your life and everything. And you're like on this roller coaster of unfamiliar ride.
It does feel like that, especially in the beginning. It just feels like your whole life has been upended and you've been hit with a sledgehammer and everything feels unpredictable. And then I think we can really make choices about how we engage with it, how we seek support for it, how we learn to talk about it, how we learn to carry our grief.
Mm-hmm.
But because it's so overwhelming like that in the beginning, I think we often try to run away from it, or we try to like tamp it down, or we try to deflect or distract. And so this book is really about like, let's not do that. Let's do the opposite of that. Like, someone once told me about anxiety, which I also talk and think a lot about and experience a lot. Someone once told me that it's like, that advice when you're on an icy road and your car is skidding, you're supposed to lean into the curve and so that you can get control of the steering wheel. I feel like it's like that. Anxiety is like that. Grief is like that. Life's kind of like that, right? Like lean into it so that you can actually engage with it.
So I took that to mean when your car is skidding, you should turn the way the car is skidding. But that's actually not right, because I got in a car accident when I was like 18 and I just kept turning and turning the wheel. And so that I ended up like doing front, back, front into the bumper in the middle of the highway because I kept twisting my own car. The point is you're supposed to like get it back straight.
I think you lean into it in order to start to get that control, and then you can take it in your own directions.
Oh, yeah. So maybe don't take it too literally. I feel like there's something similar about grief and pregnancy where you don't know how your body and your emotions are going to respond to being pregnant. But once you've been pregnant a few times, you realize like, oh, this is what my body does. And this is how I kind of feel when I'm pregnant. And then once you've had grief like hit you, or you've had losses hit you, like, then you're like, oh, this is my grief response. Like, what's going on here? This is how I grieve. So I feel like they're like, you don't know if you're going to be like a cute pregnant person or like a hideous pregnant person. It's like, you just have to wait and find out. You don't know if you're going to be a hideous griever or what. It just like happens.
No, it's true. It really can change so much about us. I think, you don't know if you're going to be an extroverted griever or an introverted. Like maybe you're going to be someone who writes and talks a lot about it, or maybe you just like get really private about your grief. And that's something that you really may not know until it happens. Yeah. But I think you're right about, our grief does show up in kind of certain inherent ways. And the more you get to know it through each loss, you start to recognize it and it becomes kind of familiar.
Yeah. Then I feel like sometimes you realize it's applying to things that are not necessarily deaths, which of course you talk about it, losses, and you talk about things like, loss of, well, I guess a pet, loss of a home, or loss of a career, or loss of a marriage, or loss of, there are other ways to lose things that are not life and death situations that can still completely elicit a grief response.
Yeah, I think we grieve throughout our lifetimes. And I think we start really young. We grieve like teachers we say goodbye to, and homes we move from, and pets, and parents getting divorced, or all kinds of things, not getting on a team that we were trying out for. That's grief.
When we traded in one of our cars, my daughter at the time, who was like, I don't know, 4, was like sobbing outside. She could not bear to part with this car. And I was like, you don't even like this car. What does she do? It's the same car. We're just getting the new model of the car. Anyway, but yeah, grief can hit you at any age.
It really can. I remember my parents cut down a tree in our yard when I was like in 4th grade, and I was bereft. I was sobbing, saying goodbye to the tree, wrote a poem about it. I've always been a big feeler.
Such emotional souls here, like. Well, the book is great in that you chop it into little digestible bits, right? Almost like, okay, today, the physicality of grief, right? Like, let me go to that section because why am I having, I don't know, headaches or stomach ache, or why can I, or, all these different things that are part of the journey, so to speak. So tell me about the way you structured the book and kind of the way you address these things. And did you do this because this is sort of the attention span of a griever to begin with?
Yeah, exactly. I just like, you don't need one more overwhelming thing when you're grieving, right? So I just wanted to make it really palatable and bite-sized, and just you can flip through it. You can open it anywhere. Some of the little chapters and sections are like a half a page, maybe that's what you can handle today, or that's what you need today. And I just wanted to make it something that you can kind of come back to whenever. I always hear people tell me that they bought like every grief book on the market when they first go through a loss, and then they don't remember any of them later, and they start going back to them like a year or two later and being like, oh, which one really speaks to me now?
Yep.
So just kind of thinking about that. I was thinking a lot about what people are looking for when they're first grieving, and it's like you're trying to orient yourself to a new landscape, right? And you're like trying to get your bearings, and it's hard to figure out. And there's a lot of stuff out there around grief now. The pandemic really bloomed so much about grief. And so there's a lot to pick and choose from, which I think is amazing. 27 years ago when my mother died, there was like nothing out there. And people were just like, you'll be fine. You're 18, you've got your whole life ahead of you. Just soldier on.
I remember getting grief books after 9/11, not for me, but which I should have done, which is stupid. But anyway, but for the people around me who I didn't think knew how to handle how I was feeling the right way. So I was like, I'm going to give you a book.
I love that.
Maybe this will help you. I still have some of those books. Like I know where they are, where they live, and they still pop around. I don't know. I must have gotten copies for myself too or something. Anyway.
It's a really weird thing where the people who are grieving end up being the ones educating others about grief, like how to talk with us, how to hold space for us, how to think about it, and I think that it's like, why we have to take on one more thing, or that's a big thing to also have to take on. But I hear it all day long from people.
You have a section on complicated grief. So you're like, don't judge yourself. Grief is grief. Like, and then you had something like, well, what if like nobody liked the person who died? Like, how do you feel about that? Or what if you have a really unhappy what if you're glad the person died? I mean, this speaks to, Jeanette McCurdy's book, right? And I'm glad my mom died. Talk about that for a minute.
I have so many people that had complicated relationships with the people they lost. Maybe you had an abusive spouse. Maybe your person suffered from mental illness or addiction, or you'd been estranged from them for many years, or they were just harmful to you in some way and you'd set up boundaries, and then they die. And there's still grief there. It might not be the same kind of grief someone who had a loving relationship is experiencing, but there is still grief. And so then you're sorting through not only your grief, but this like complicated relationship, or the complicated layers, or judgment from people saying, well, you're grieving that person. And you're like, yeah, you're grieving maybe the relationship you never got to have. There's such a finality when they die that you suddenly get really hit with like, oh my God, we never ever got to repair that, or we never got to have this fantasy version I've been holding onto in my head. And so there's a lot of layers. And I think that can just make grief very complicated.
That's interesting. When do you know when you need to see a grief counselor versus you're just grieving? Like you say, you see people all day and you've been seeing people for so long, and so many grief counselors do. How does a person know when how do you know? How do you know when to take that step?
I don't think everyone needs to see a grief counselor or go to a support group. I think that when you maybe are really having trouble functioning in your day-to-day life, the grief is really consuming you, or you don't have any support around you. You don't have anybody who can understand or is willing to listen. A lot of people experience anxiety in their grief and loss, if that's something that's overtaking you, or some of these complicated relationships that I'm talking about, or you experienced a traumatic loss. I work with people who've lost a loved one to gun violence, mass shootings or various things like that. There's so much that you have to process and sit through and unpack, and that should not be done on your own. It's just too much. It's too much to sort through. One-on-one, coaches, counselors, therapists are amazing. Also support groups. I lead a bunch of support groups, and they're so beautiful to watch people connect. I have a support group for moms who've lost kids, and it's so heartbreaking, but it's also like some of the most beautiful and real conversations I have all week is in that group, and I think that just being able to go into a space where other people really get what you're going through and you can say things that nobody else really understands or is able to hear, that can be really helpful and healing. And then there's like a light level, right? Where you just like listen to podcasts and read books and like look at some grief stuff on Instagram. And maybe that's like totally enough and helpful. And that's fine too.
Wow. There is this whole community of grief experts who are really fun, awesome, great people who love to have a good time. It's exhibited by the party that you threw for Megan Reardon Jarvis, where I was like, oh my gosh, I can't believe all these grief experts are in the same photo. Like the photos from that event, I don't usually like spend a lot of time looking at other people's party pictures. Oh my gosh.
Megan made me this book.
Oh, okay. For people listening, it's literally like everyone from Steve Leonard to Tembi Locke to like every grief expert in the world are in these like, it's like a bar mitzvah album or something. Anyway, is it the knowledge that you all have in particular each and every day? Like, this is it. Let's live it up. Or is it that such nice, kind people become grief counselors to begin with? What do you think it is?
Yeah, I think it's all of that. I think all of us have been like broken down to our depths, with our losses. And then we've rebuilt ourselves and encompassed so much compassion and empathy and just this like desire to be in the world as soak it up as much as we can. Everyone I know who's really immersed in this space all the time, they're also the most fun people I know. They really know how to live. They know how to, seek meaning and just enjoy every moment and treasure and cherish friendships and relationships and experiences. And they're pretty amazing. I mean, the same was true when I worked in hospice. I felt like every single doctor, nurse, social worker, everyone who worked in hospice, even just doing paperwork, admin, were just incredible people. And I think it's when you really face and embrace death and it makes you value life so much more. It's a weird trait.
No, I mean, you said in the book, like no one sets out to become a grief counselor. No one knows this will be their life path until something happens, usually to them or whatever. When did you know that this was something that you had to do?
I grew up wanting to be a writer, which I am. This is my 5th book, 6th coming for you. And
Chop, chop.
I always wanted to be a writer. And then my parents died and I really like hit rock bottom in so many ways that I outlined in that first memoir that you read and your mother read and loved too. And then
we're laughing because I had an event for Claire along with an author named Sarah McCall, who by the way I've totally lost touch with. But anyway, at our home in LA, and my mom happened to be there and was asking or making lots of comments.
She was so proud of me for having like made such a mess of myself and then gotten back together.
That's right. She couldn't believe it.
Yeah. Look at you. You're so put together.
Yeah, you're okay. I don't know what she thought. She would like pull up and see like you on my living room floor or something. Anyway.
But gosh, what was I saying? So I was trying to continue as a writer after my parents died. And I was, writing for magazines and doing various things. And it just kind of felt meaningless. And I went into therapy finally, and I found it really illuminating and fascinating. I think there's a lot of threads that cross over between therapy and writing. Being a therapist, all I do all day is help people explore their narratives and look at the stories they carry and look at the way they tell a story, the way they hold it. And so often it's about helping them rewrite it, taking out pieces that don't serve them, really looking at certain parts of the story that maybe aren't accurate, but they've been holding on to it for a certain reason, or bringing in other pieces of the story that they were unwilling or afraid to acknowledge. So there's a lot there around storytelling. I mean, I think as humans, we're innate storytellers. And when we go through grief and loss, becomes a story about that loss and that person and that relationship. So anyway, I went back to get my master's in clinical psychology. And I remember there was one class that was an elective that was kind of about like aging and dying, and nobody wanted to take it. And I was like one of like 5 people in there, and everyone I knew, all of my fellow classmates, they were like, oh, grief, I would never work in that space. And I was like, oh, well, I'm happy to talk about it all day. So I think I should do that because nobody else wants to. And I went straight into hospice after that.
Oh. I remember getting to college and being like, I thought I wanted to be an English major. And I was like, I'm going to be a writer. I'm going to be an English major. And I was like, I don't want to take any of these English classes. These look terrible. And then I was like, every single psychology class looks amazing. Like, do these not look amazing to everybody else? Like, don't they? And people are like, no, I'm heading to like econ and I'm going to do history. And I'm like, but look at these.
Well, every single class was so fascinating.
Right? Oh
Even like the law and ethics, because every law was built upon like something really messed up that had happened in like a therapeutic practice. It was
so
fascinating.
Yeah. Like neurobiology, like chemicals, like that was so cool. Like all this stuff. I don't know. I guess for people interested in people, it sounds so obvious. But anyway, we find our paths somehow. You have 4 main buckets in this book and your approach to conscious grieving. Can you just like quickly run through what those are and why they're important?
Yeah, they're just entering into grief, which is kind of that initial thing that we talked about where it's like it doesn't feel like a choice. You're just entering into this thing that's happening to you. So how to orient in that place and time, how to take care of yourself, and then engaging with it. So really choosing to start making conscious decisions about how you're going to move through it and carry it and take care of yourself, and then kind of surrendering to it. I think it takes time for us to really accept that this is our life now. It's nice we can accept the reality of the loss, but we haven't accepted that, like, God, I'm going to have to go my whole life. Like, this is what's happening from here on with this person gone. So there's a surrendering to the process of the way that grief transforms our lives and transforms us. And that final piece is the transforming through grief. And that's about like post-loss growth. And that's about all the ways that we really can grow as people and learn so much from going through loss.
And when in the grieving process is the right time, do you think, to read this book?
Oh, anytime. You can read it in the first week. You can read it in the 5th year, whatever works. And that it's really something you can kind of come back to over and over and skim through and pick up different pieces of.
Awesome. Well, this is also a really great, gift. I don't mean to say like if you're looking for a gift, but for someone when you don't know what to do and someone you love is really struggling, this is a great tool to hand over. I would say maybe not in like that first week where everything is like the funeral and the chaos. Maybe give it like 2 weeks, even like at the month anniversary, put it in your calendar for somebody you're really close to or something. And then like when the chaos dies down and they're left with like the life that they thought that they were going to live, but it's totally different and they have to like get back on their feet. I feel like that's a really good time for the book to come.
I think so too. Yeah, people get really scared of what to do and say after someone they know has gone through a big loss. And I think just showing up and just also, like you just said, like it doesn't have to be right in the beginning. Like keep remembering, keep, acknowledging that they're going through that. So many of my clients are like, oh, it's been 6 months and nobody talks to me anymore. No one brings it up anymore. And it's like everybody's forgotten that I'm going through this.
I think the biggest misconception is you're not supposed to bring up the loss. Because you're worried about upsetting the person who is obviously just thinking about their loss anyway. So, and that they like hearing that you shouldn't avoid saying the person's name who's passed away. Like in general, you love that person so much that it's nice when people bring it up or share a memory. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. Stephen Colbert talks about it too. He said something like, people will tell me they didn't want to bring it up because they didn't want me to make me think about it. And he's like, I'm already thinking about it all the time. Yeah. Like, please bring them up.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Interesting. Okay, you want to tell us about your next memoir project?
I will tell you more at some point.
Okay, I'm just joking. And I don't mean for this episode to be flip, because I'm sure people are listening who really do need help and are grieving. But I think that there is also the necessity, I think there is a need and a requirement for the combination of humor in loss and finding any sort of joy or any sort of, it evokes such extreme reactions. So I don't know.
Yeah, I think we have to have that balance of light and laughter too, sometimes within grief. And yeah.
I like when I'm saying something that's not making any sense and you just repeat it back in a way that's completely clear and articulate.
That's my job as a therapist.
Okay.
That's what I do all day.
I'm going to just start forwarding you some of my emails and you can just like rephrase them. And
Make everything sound better. Oh my goodness. All right. Well, Claire, thank you so much. Conscious Grieving, a transformative approach to healing from loss, everything that you've learned in one book. So thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you, Zibby. Thanks for everything you're doing for authors and grievers and mamas and everybody.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to Moms Don't Have Time to Read Books. If you love it, please leave a review and follow us on social at Zibby Owens and at Zibby Readers.